Hi, I'm Dr. King Owen. We're going to take a look at some World War II interpretations. This is kind of a quasi short answer question activity. So we'll look at the interpretations and then think about how they can be supported with evidence, but also they may modify your understanding of the history that we're learning. Much of the time when you're given an SAQ that involves a couple of historians arguing about some event in history, you're going to be asked to support that with a fact. Sometimes you might be asked to refute with evidence, but very often it is the case that you come up with your own evidence that supports the interpretation given. So for example, if I had given you a piece that said World War II expanded opportunities for minorities, you might support that with a piece of evidence that 6 million women found jobs during the war as quote unquote Rosie the Riveters. So you brought a fact to the table and it supported my general claim that opportunities for minorities expanded. But sometimes you'll encounter an interpretation that modifies your understanding. So you will have an idea about World War II and women, but this another interpretation will add a layer of complexity or nuance to what you think about the topic. For example, we all learn about Rosie the Riveter. We see images of Rosie the Riveter. There's even a song about Rosie the Riveter. And the memories of that tends to create this image of Rosie as the strong white woman doing a man's job in the factory. She's got the riveting gun, she's putting the plane together. But in fact, there's a lot of historians who pointed out that Rosie the Riveter was not necessarily white. And many minority women, Black and Latina Rosies, also contributed to wartime production. This modification of the concept of Rosie the Riveter gives you a more complete, complicated picture of what's going on during the war, and it challenges the propaganda posters that we see during that war that make us all think that Rosie is white. So in the activity, I've given you several historians' interpretations, and where possible, if you can find evidence to support them, great. But it might also be that the case that the interpretation offered will be a modification of your understanding and might force you to reassess a concept that you think you already know. So let's take a look at all the interpretations that deal with women. The first one is called bitter fruit. In this particular interpretation, Maureen Honey talks about the fact that African American women don't get put into all of the propaganda for World War II. All the recruitment posters, newsreels, all of the material you would see during the war shows white women. She says it's a sea of white faces, and it erased the contributions of African American women to the home front war. I would say that this offers you a chance to modify your interpretation of Rosie the Riveter and take the image that you have of Rosie being white and now make it more nuanced and recognize they're African American Rosies. You could also link this to our lecture discussion of African Americans and the discrimination they faced during the war. Since this is a kind of erasure of their portrayal, the government not showing them, it also highlights the effect of Jim Crow in American society. A second interpretation, Melissa McEwen's Making War, Making Women, also invites us to rethink our Rosie the War image. Rosie is often pictured as this muscular, strong woman with some kind of tool in her hand. She's, out there working on the B-19. But in fact, according to McEwen, this image breaks down because more women went to work during the war doing laundry and dictation than actually building airplanes. And in fact, Rosie, the masculine strong image of Rosie, is outweighed by thousands of pictures of hyper-feminized women. Now, in the lecture, I talked about the war widening the gulf between masculinity and femininity. And in fact, we see lots of evidence during the war suggesting that men going off to the war don't want to be replaced by masculinized women. They want to imagine beautiful feminine sweethearts at home that they are saving the world for. And so a lot of the images of women during the war are over-sexualized, over-feminized. And so this modifies our understanding of Rosie, but also connects to something that we did talk about in the lecture. Our last interpretation of women looks at Mexican-American women. And the argument here by Elizabeth Escobedo is that Mexican-American women had an interesting and malleable place between white women and black women. They were racially malleable in a way that African-American women could not be. It didn't mean that they didn't experience racism and didn't experience rejection of them for their identities and their culture, but it did mean that they could play roles in home and home front activities more easily than some African American women. And that was made possible partially by wartime conditions and the ideology of racial liberalism. It's hard to fight a war against fascism while being fascist at home. It takes a lot of mental gymnastics to make those positions work together when they contradict. Those Southerners are really good at it, as we're going to see. So this is a modification of your understanding, because in the lecture we talked about the Bracero program, but we didn't talk about Mexican-American women and their contributions. And also, we don't think of Rosie the Riveter as Mexican-American either. The next set of interpretations in the SAQ are from African-American points of view. And we will start with Kathleen German's Promises of Citizenship, which argues that wartime emphasis on cooperation, on liberalism, on accepting people, helped to kind of put pressure on Jim Crow segregation by making it less defensible. So she says, the war prepared Americans for the challenges of creating a more just society. Lots of things you could do here to support this argument. You could point to the formation of CORE, the Double V campaign, but you could also argue against this argument to say things like segregation in the military remained during the war and would remain until 1948. So this helps us connect to stuff we've learned in the lecture, but it does offer a slight modification of that material as well. The next interpretation is Kevin Gaines's Civil Rights Movement and World Perspective, in which he tries to point to the fact that civil rights is not just an American issue. It's not just fighting Double V and fighting for Double V and against Jim Crow at home, but he says it's connected to world events. African Americans linked what's going on in the US to the cause of decolonization around the world, which you might have studied in a previous world studies class before, that World War II and before World War II, many of the countries of the world that were colonies of the imperialistic powers are pushing for independence. And so we see this in Asia and Africa. African Americans in the United States can link to those decolonization movements and say that fighting for freedom against fascism and Jim Crow is not just an American thing, it's a worldwide thing. I would argue that this piece is kind of a modification of what we've talked about. It adds a layer of nuance to our discussions of double V and makes you think of double V not just as an American homegrown activity. The next piece is Joe William Trotter's Raw Deal to New Deal. Trotter is talking about discrimination, but also migration, as African Americans living in urban areas increased pretty dramatically during the war, particularly in Western cities. And that leads, as he notes, to racial tensions and violence in several cities like Detroit, for example. This, I think, connects to the lecture in which we talked about the Second Great Migration, where African Americans in search of wartime jobs will go out and become the Black Rosie, the Riveters. They will work in defense plants as these wartime opportunities are being offered to them. So I would say that you could pull material out of the lecture in order to support Joe William Trotter's argument. We had an interpretation of Mexican-American women, Hispanic women, in a previous interpretation offered already. But we also have a section on Mexican-Americans in general, which we have talked about in the lecture, the Bracero program, government propaganda to talk about Americans, all todos Americanos. So let's look at this argument by Richard Griswold del Castillo, who notes that opportunities available to all Americans were not available equally. So jobs favored by the military industries typically went to favored groups in America, white Americans, and discriminatory practices kept Mexican Americans from getting those wartime jobs. I'd argue this modifies our understanding of the war experience for Mexican Americans. We've mentioned the Bracero program, but Mexican Americans will also work where possible and when possible in defense industries as well. And we've mentioned too discrimination in the form of the Zoot Suit riots, which affected youths in America, African American as well as Mexican American youths, who favored those large Zoot Suits, particular kind of outfit that proclaimed their youth culture. So this piece here modifies our understanding of the material that we've already had and adds to our understanding of what discrimination does to Mexican Americans. Our last interpretation that we're going to look at is Japanese Americans, arguably the most scrutinized group during the war and certainly the most punished as a group for their minority status. In Brian Hayashi's Democratizing the Enemy, he makes a complicated argument about what drives the internment of the Japanese. The people who created the internment policy said that race and culture were the same, therefore Japanese Americans are really just Japanese people. And therefore, since their race and their culture are the same thing, they're loyal to Japan. We must remove them and put them in camps. But then he argues, this is sort of like the almost contradictory here, that the people who ran these camps saw loyalty as coming from culture. And so within the camps themselves, American-born Japanese being immersed in American culture were seen as loyal to the United States because they were, of course, trapped in a camp where what else could you do? So interestingly enough, this policy that's born in this racist idea that being Japanese American just means Japanese ends up reaffirming the Americanness of those people in the camps, since they're trapped in the camp and therefore they're trapped in American culture. It becomes a very self-reinforcing, self-justifying policy to say that the Japanese need to be taken out of circulation because they're a threat, and then to say, yeah, but they're also going to be fine because they're going to be trapped in these camps, where we can reinforce Americanness by immersing them in American culture. I will add to this too, research has shown generally the Japanese accommodated the United States' internment policy for the most part, didn't fight it, went along with it. It must have been a very hard decision to feel like you don't really have much choice, and the only way to prove that you're really loyal is to go along with something that strips you of your rights and treats you as a second-class citizen. So this is an interesting argument that could connect to the lecture. You could talk about, for example, the Supreme Court rulings for Korematsu in the context of the war, saying that the camps were a wartime necessity and a military necessity and not really based in race, though I think the Supreme Court they were lying to themselves to make the policy work. You could talk about the internment policy itself, but I think also this interpretation helps modify our understanding of that experience and really get to sort of see how our Americans in the 40s thought about race, racial identity, but also culture. Even for us, we still struggle to think about race as something in your blood, in your skin, but race is also something that's a part of your cultural background and identity. And lots of minorities in the United States have this debate all the time. You know, is it something in you that makes you part of this ethnic group? So it's an ongoing debate we have, and I think this source helps kind of think about the linkages between race and culture in the context of Japanese internment. That's been a look at several interpretations of minority experience during World War II that both add to things we've learned as well as modify them. Thank you. We'll see you next time.